I'm Allison Carter, 32, and I came home after a grueling 12-hour hospital shift to find my apartment half empty. My first thought? Break in. Heart racing, I called my mother, who answered with disturbing calm. I gave your furniture to Megan. Your sister needs it more than you do. Furniture I'd saved 3 years to buy. $13,800 worth. Gone. Given away while I was helping save lives. Mom's voice turned cold when I protested. You've always been selfish, Allison. That's when I realized this betrayal was just the latest chapter in a lifelong story. Before I dive into this nightmare, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. If you've ever had family take advantage of you, hit that like button. Subscribe to hear more stories about standing up to toxic family members. Now let's get into how my own mother robbed me blind and tried to gaslight me about it. I grew up in a seemingly normal middle-class household in Wellesley, a suburb outside Boston. From the outside, we looked like the perfect American family. Father Robert, who worked as an investment advisor, Mother Diane, who managed a small boutique, me, and my younger sister Megan. But behind closed doors, our family dynamic was anything but perfect. From my earliest memories, my mother clearly favored Megan. It started with small things, Megan getting new clothes while I got hand-me-downs, despite our family being financially comfortable. Megan's accomplishments were celebrated with parties and gifts, while mine warranted a simple good job if I was lucky. I told myself it was because Megan was 3 years younger, that she needed more attention. I made excuses for the disparity because that's what children do when they don't understand why a parent doesn't seem to love them equally. When I was 15, our family trajectory changed dramatically. My father, returning home from a late business meeting, was killed in a car accident. Beyond the emotional devastation, his death completely altered our financial situation. My father had been successful and prudent with money. He had life insurance, savings, and investments that were supposed to provide for all of us. After the funeral, I overheard my mother speaking with the family lawyer. My father had left specific instructions about our inheritance, equal portions for both Megan and me for college, with some accessible immediately and some held in trust until we turned 25. The remainder went to my mother to maintain our lifestyle and home. But something strange happened in the months following my father's death. My mother took complete control of all financial matters. When I asked about college funds my junior year of high school, she became evasive. We need to be careful with money now, she'd say. Your father's plans didn't account for everything. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? So I applied for every scholarship I could find. I worked 2 part-time jobs during high school, at the local library and waiting tables on weekends. I saved every dollar possible. Meanwhile, Megan continued her dance lessons, got a car for her 16th birthday, and never seemed to worry about money. I got into Boston University with a partial scholarship, but it wasn't enough to cover everything. When I approached my mother about using some of my inheritance, she said it had been mostly depleted by necessary expenses, no explanation beyond that. So I worked my way through college, taking out loans, working 30-plus hours weekly at a coffee shop and as a campus research assistant, all while maintaining a full course load in nursing. During those years, the pattern with my sister continued. Megan attended Northeastern University, lived in a nice off-campus apartment my mother helped her secure, and never seemed to have financial worries. When I asked how Megan could afford her lifestyle, my mother would say, "She's better with money than you are," or "She got more scholarships." I later discovered neither was true. After college, I worked relentlessly to pay off my student loans and build my career. I started as a floor nurse before getting my master's degree at night and eventually becoming a hospital administrator. It took years of sacrifice, living with roommates in a cramped apartment, rarely taking vacations, picking up extra shifts, but by 30, I was finally debt-free with a growing savings account. Last year, I finally felt financially secure enough to treat myself. I'd been living in a decent but sparsely furnished one-bedroom apartment, saving aggressively. I decided it was time to create a home that reflected my hard work. I spent months researching and selecting each piece. A custom sectional sofa in sumptuous navy velvet that I could actually stretch out on after 12-hour shifts. A solid oak dining table where I could host the friends who'd supported me. A bedroom set with the kind of quality that would last decades. Each purchase represented not just a functional item but a milestone. The dining table meant I could finally host Thanksgiving instead of always being a guest. The plush reading chair by the window was where I planned to study for my healthcare executive certification. The luxury mattress was an investment in better sleep after years of back pain from lifting patients. Little did I know that creating this sanctuary for myself would trigger the most blatant betrayal my mother and sister had orchestrated yet. Looking back, I should have seen the signs when I gave my mother a tour of my newly furnished apartment. While I beamed with pride, she examined each piece with a calculating eye, asking pointed questions about the cost and where I had purchased everything. At the time, I mistook her interest for admiration. "You've done well for yourself," she said, but her tone held something I couldn't identify then. Now I know it wasn't pride. It was assessment. The day everything changed started like any other. I arrived at the hospital at 6 a.m. for my administrative shift, which quickly became chaotic when 2 nurses called in sick and we were short-staffed. As the department manager, I stepped in to help with patient care, extending my already long day into a 12-hour marathon of stress and physical exertion. By the time I dragged myself home at 7:30 p.m., I was fantasizing about sinking into my plush sofa with a glass of wine and maybe ordering takeout. I remember fumbling with my keys at the door, shoulders aching, feet throbbing in my sensible work shoes. When I pushed open the door and flicked on the lights, my brain couldn't immediately process what I was seeing. My beautiful living room was half empty. The navy velvet sectional that had been the centerpiece of the room, gone. The artisan coffee table I'd splurged on, vanished. I stood frozen, keys still dangling from my fingers, wondering if I'd somehow entered the wrong apartment. I moved through my home in a daze, cataloging each missing piece. From the living room, my custom $4,200 sectional sofa, $850 artisan coffee table, $600 media console, and 2 accent chairs worth $700 each. From the dining area, the complete solid oak dining set with 6 chairs totaling $3,100. From my bedroom, the entire $5,500 bedroom suite including king bed frame, nightstands, dresser, and armoire. Even the artwork and decorative items I'd carefully selected, worth over $1,000, had been taken. In total, $13,800 worth of furniture, representing years of saving and months of careful selection, had simply vanished. There was no sign of forced entry. Nothing else appeared disturbed. My electronics, jewelry, and other valuables remained untouched. This wasn't a typical break-in. With shaking hands, I called my mother. I remember exactly how casual her voice sounded when she answered. "Mom, I think I've been robbed," I said, my voice cracking. "All my furniture is gone." There was a pause, then, "Oh, that. No, you weren't robbed. I had some movers take it to Megan's new place this morning." I thought I'd misheard her. "You? What? You took my furniture?" Megan just finalized her divorce from Tyler, my mother explained as if discussing the weather. She needed to furnish her new condo, and your things were exactly her style. "You're doing so well, you can just buy new furniture." I sank to the floor of my nearly empty living room, trying to process what I was hearing. "Mom, that furniture cost me almost $14,000. I saved for years. You had no right to take it. Don't be so selfish, Allison. My mother's voice hardened. Your sister is going through a difficult time. She has nothing after leaving Tyler. This is what family does. We help each other. Help each other? You didn't help me. You stole from me. I was shouting now, my exhaustion giving way to rage. Did you even think to ask me first? I knew you'd make a big deal out of it, she replied coolly. Megan needs support right now, not your materialistic attitude. I hung up and immediately called Megan. When she answered, I demanded to know if she had my furniture. Mom said you were upgrading and didn't need it anymore, Megan claimed, though her voice held a note of uncertainty that told me she wasn't being truthful. When I pressed her, her story quickly changed. Okay, fine, she finally admitted. Mom said you owed me after all the years you were so cold to me during my marriage troubles. She said this would make things even between us. Even? What are you talking about? I was genuinely confused. I've never done anything to hurt you, Megan. You've always been the successful one, she said bitterly. Perfect Allison with her perfect career and perfect apartment. Do you know how that feels? To constantly live in your shadow? I was stunned. While I'd been working multiple jobs and drowning in student debt, Megan had somehow constructed a narrative where I was the privileged one. That doesn't give you the right to take my things, I said firmly. I need my furniture back. Today. It's already been set up, she said defensively. The mover's mom arranged everything. I'm not dismantling my whole apartment because you're having a tantrum. When I asked how they'd even gotten into my apartment, I discovered the first of many betrayals. My mother had used the spare key I'd given her years ago for emergencies, like if I locked myself out or needed someone to water my plants during a work trip. Never had I imagined she would use it to orchestrate a furniture heist. Even more disturbing was learning about the moving company. My mother had called them claiming the furniture was a donation to her daughter who was starting over after a tragedy. She'd presented herself as a generous mother helping both her daughters, giving my possessions to Megan while supposedly having my full consent. What began as shock was rapidly transforming into white-hot anger. I'd been violated, not by strangers, but by the people who were supposed to love me most. As I sat on the bare floor of my apartment that night, I made a decision. This time, I wouldn't let them get away with it. The morning after discovering the theft, I called the local police department to file a report. The officer who took my call seemed sympathetic at first, but his attitude changed when I explained who had taken my furniture. So your mother took the furniture and gave it to your sister? He clarified. Ma'am, that sounds like a family matter, not a criminal one. It's theft, I insisted. The furniture was purchased by me, belongs to me, and was taken without my permission. The total value is over $13,800. After some back and forth, the officer agreed to send someone to take a report, but made it clear they considered this a civil dispute. The officer who arrived, a middle-aged man named Officer Martinez, was slightly more helpful but still reluctant to treat this as a criminal matter. Do you have receipts for these items? He asked, notepad in hand. Fortunately, I'm organized by nature and quickly produce digital receipts for every piece. I also showed him credit card statements proving I'd made the purchases. That helps, he acknowledged. But since your mother had a key and there was no forced entry, and given the family relationship, the district attorney would likely consider this a civil rather than criminal matter. He filed the report but advised me that my best course of action would be small claims court or civil court, depending on the jurisdiction's limit for small claims. Frustrated but determined, I called my friend Jessica, a lawyer specializing in family law. We'd met during my brief stint in hospital legal affairs before I moved to administration. Jessica had always been direct and honest with me, qualities I desperately needed now. This is absolutely theft, Allison, Jessica said firmly after hearing my story. The fact that it's your mother doesn't change the legal reality. But Officer Martinez is right about one thing. It might be difficult to pursue criminally. She explained my options in detail. Small claims court would be simpler but had a maximum claim amount of $7,000 in our state. Only about half the value of what was taken. A civil lawsuit would allow me to sue for the full amount but would be more complex, potentially more expensive, and would take longer to resolve. There's also the family aspect to consider, Jessica added gently. I've seen family legal disputes get ugly. Are you prepared for that possibility? They already made it ugly by stealing from me, I replied, my voice shaking with emotion. I can't just let this go. It's not just about the furniture, it's about a lifetime of this treatment. Jessica agreed to help me prepare the necessary documentation for a civil case, becoming the first true ally in what would become a much larger battle than I initially anticipated. The financial impact hit me hard and immediately. I'd depleted much of my savings to purchase the furniture, planning to rebuild my emergency fund over the next year. Now I faced the prospect of either living in a nearly empty apartment or going into debt to replace essential items. I managed to borrow a futon from a coworker for sleeping and found a used table and chair on Craigslist for meals. My once beautiful apartment now looked like a college student's first place, and the contrast between what I'd created and what remained was a constant reminder of the betrayal. With Jessica's encouragement, I decided to reach out to other family members, both for support and to gauge how widespread knowledge of this theft might be. My father's brother, Uncle Thomas, was the first person I called. "Your mother did what?" he exclaimed when I explained the situation. His outrage was immediate and validating. Robert would be turning in his grave if he knew about this. "This isn't right, Allison." Uncle Thomas had always been kind to me, but we hadn't been particularly close since my father's death. His passionate response surprised me, and when he offered to speak to my mother on my behalf, I felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps not everyone in the family would side against me. My mother's sister, Aunt Patricia, had a very different initial reaction. "I'm sure your mother was just trying to help Megan get back on her feet," she said defensively. "The divorce has been very hard on her, you know." "It was my furniture, Aunt Patricia," I said firmly. "Everything I owned." "How would you feel if someone took everything from your living room, dining room, and bedroom without asking?" There was a long pause before she responded. "When you put it that way, I didn't realize it was everything. Diane told me it was just a few extra pieces you didn't need anymore." This became a pattern as I spoke with more relatives. My mother had been spinning a narrative that minimized her actions while maximizing Megan's need and my supposed selfishness. But when confronted with the full truth, most people were shocked by what had happened. My friends were universally supportive, with several offering furniture, help with legal costs, and places to stay if needed. My best friend Rachel was particularly vocal. "I've watched your mother favor Megan for years, but this crosses a line that can't be uncrossed. You need to stand your ground." While my support network was strengthening, the situation was taking a toll on my professional life. I found myself distracted at work, checking my phone constantly for updates from Jessica or responses from family members. I made a medication error, caught by a nurse before reaching a patient, that shook me deeply as a healthcare professional. My supervisor noticed the change in my performance and called me into her office. Reluctantly, I explained the situation. "Take some personal time," she advised. 3 days. Get your legal ducks in a row, get some rest, and come back focused. The patients deserve your full attention, and right now, you can't give it." She was right, of course. The emotional toll was manifesting physically. 20 insomnia had me operating on 3 to 4 hours of broken sleep a night. My appetite had vanished, and I jumped every time my phone rang. Worst of all, I found myself questioning every relationship in my life. If my own mother could betray me so completely, who could I really trust? I took the personal days, using them to meet with Jessica, organize documentation, and begin the formal process of trying to reclaim what was mine. I also started seeing a therapist, recognizing that the emotional damage from this betrayal went far deeper than the loss of material possessions. What you're experiencing is a trauma response, the therapist explained during our first session. The people who were supposed to protect you have violated your trust in a fundamental way. It's natural to feel destabilized. As I worked to stabilize my immediate situation, I had no idea that my mother was already planning her counterattack, one that would test my resolve to its limits and reveal even deeper betrayals lurking beneath the surface of our family history. About 2 weeks after the furniture theft, I began receiving concerned calls from extended family members. My cousin Heather was the first. "Are you okay, Allison? Aunt Diane says you've been having some emotional problems," she said hesitantly. "What? What are you talking about?" I asked, genuinely confused. "She mentioned you've been making some accusations and that we shouldn't take them seriously because you're under a lot of stress at work. She's worried about you." It didn't take long to piece together what was happening. My mother had launched a preemptive strike, a smear campaign to discredit me before I could fully tell my side of the story. I discovered she'd been calling and emailing family members, describing me as unstable, work-obsessed, and having a breakdown. The most damaging narrative she created was that I had abandoned Megan during her divorce crisis, refusing to help her when she needed it most. According to my mother, the furniture had been a gift I had initially offered but then cruelly rescinded when Megan was at her most vulnerable. "Your sister lost everything in that divorce," my Uncle Peter told me when I called to correct the record. "Diane says you promised to help furnish her new place, then changed your mind out of spite." "That's absolutely false," I insisted, my blood boiling. "I never offered my furniture to anyone. Mom took it without my knowledge while I was at work." The doubt in his voice was clear. "That's not how Diane tells it." The family quickly divided into camps. Those who knew me well enough to question my mother's version of events, like Uncle Thomas and a few cousins, stood by me. Others, particularly those closer to my mother and sister, accepted their story without question. Most hurtful was when my mother escalated her threats. She called me directly one evening, her voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "If you continue with this lawsuit nonsense, I'll have no choice but to remove you from my will entirely," she said. "Is that what you want? To destroy what's left of this family over some furniture?" "This isn't about furniture, Mom," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "It's about respect and honesty. You stole from me. I've sacrificed everything for you girls," she countered. "Everything. And this is the thanks I get? From my own daughter?" The conversation deteriorated from there, ending with her hanging up on me. Later that night, I received an email from her with an attachment that stunned me. A copy of my most recent bank statement. Somehow, my mother had gained access to my financial information. As you can see, her email read, "You're in a position to replace these items easily. Megan has nothing. If you really care about family, you'll drop this vindictive campaign against us." I immediately called my bank, changing all my passwords and security questions, and placed fraud alerts on my accounts. The bank representative confirmed someone had accessed my information online using security question answers they would likely know. My childhood pet's name, the street where I grew up. I felt violated all over again. The following weekend, I made the mistake of attending a family birthday party for my cousin's child. I'd hoped to maintain relationships with family members not directly involved in the conflict, especially the children who shouldn't suffer because of adult disagreements. Instead, I walked into an ambush. My mother and sister were there, despite not being particularly close to this branch of the family. They had clearly arranged to be present knowing I would attend. Several relatives immediately cornered me, demanding I make peace and stop this foolishness. My cousin Ryan, who had initially been supportive in private conversations, now publicly sided with my mother. "Allison, this has gone too far," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Family has to come first. You've always been the strong one. Can't you be the bigger person here?" This was the second major betrayal, someone I'd trusted taking the easier path of siding with my mother rather than standing up for what was right. Later, I discovered my mother had offered to help finance Ryan's struggling business, with the implicit understanding that he would help pressure me to drop the matter. The most revealing moment came when my mother, seeing that I remained unmoved by the pressure, pulled me aside and made a chilling statement. "You know, I've always tried to be fair to both my girls," she said. "But the truth is, you've always had advantages Megan didn't. You're smarter, more driven, better looking. You've always been able to take care of yourself. Megan needs help, she always has. Is it really so wrong for a mother to try to even things out a bit?" I was speechless. In her twisted logic, stealing from me was simply evening things out, as if my hard work and sacrifice were advantages that needed to be penalized rather than achievements to be respected. When I continued to stand my ground, she played her final card. "If you push this, Allison, I'll have no choice but to tell everyone about your problems in high school. The therapy, the medication, everything." She was referring to a period after my father's death when I'd struggled with depression and anxiety, hardly surprising for a teenager who'd just lost a parent. I'd sought help, taken medication briefly, and worked through my grief in healthy ways. But my mother was now threatening to weaponize this normal response to trauma, twisting it into something shameful to try to control me. I nearly broke under the combined weight of the public pressure and private threats. That night, I sat in my half-empty apartment, questioning whether the fight was worth the cost. The furniture, as valuable as it was, seemed insignificant compared to potentially losing my entire family. I called Jessica, my lawyer friend, in tears. "Maybe I should just let it go," I said. "Is it worth all this?" Her response was measured but firm. "Only you can answer that, Allison. But consider this. If you let them get away with this, what's next? This isn't just about furniture, it's about standing up to abuse. Whatever you decide, I'm in your corner." That conversation was a turning point. I realized this battle was about much more than reclaiming my possessions. It was about reclaiming my self-respect and setting boundaries that should have been established long ago. As painful as it was, I decided to continue fighting, not knowing that what I would discover next would shake the very foundation of everything I believed about my family. After the confrontation at the family gathering, I knew I needed to gather all possible evidence to support my case. Jessica advised me to locate the original receipts for the furniture, along with any documentation showing I had paid for the items myself. I began searching through my files, both digital and physical, to build the strongest case possible. While organizing financial documents in my home office, I came across a folder I hadn't opened in years. It contained papers from my father's estate that I'd kept after his death. I hadn't looked at them since I was 18, partly because they were painful reminders of his loss, and partly because my mother had handled all the financial arrangements. Out of thoroughness, I decided to review them. What I found stopped me cold. Inside was a copy of my father's will, not the summary my mother had shown us, but the complete document with details I'd never seen before. According to this will, my father had indeed left equal inheritances for both Megan and me. Specifically, he had established trust funds of $175,000 each for our education and early adult needs, with the remainder to be distributed when we turned 25. I was now 32. I had never received a penny from this trust. My hands shaking, I dug deeper into the folder and found statements from an investment account in my name dating back to when I was 15. The account had been funded with my inheritance and showed consistent growth through careful investments until I turned 18. After that, there was a pattern of withdrawals, eventually draining the account entirely. The withdrawals were signed by Diane Carter, Bryson's, my mother, A.T., using a power of attorney document that was also in the folder. A power of attorney that should have terminated when I reached adulthood. I spent the entire night going through every paper in that folder and several others, piecing together a financial history I'd never known existed. By morning, I had documented evidence of a systematic fraud spanning 17 years. The earliest withdrawal coincided with Megan's first semester at Northeastern, the same semester I was working 2 jobs to cover my expenses at Boston University because I'd been told there was no money for my education. Subsequent withdrawals aligned perfectly with major expenses in Megan's life: her junior year abroad in France, the down payment on her first condo, her lavish wedding to Tyler, all paid for with money that legally belonged to me. The total, including interest that should have accrued over the years, exceeded $320,000. I was physically ill when I understood the magnitude of the deception. All those years of struggling, taking on debt, working myself to exhaustion, while my own inheritance funded my sister's comfortable lifestyle. When I confronted my mother by phone the next day, I expected denials or excuses. Instead, her response was chillingly matter-of-fact. "You were always able to take care of yourself, Allison," she said, not bothering to dispute the evidence. "Megan needed that money more than you did. You've done fine without it, haven't you? Look at your career, your independence." Megan would have floundered without help. "That wasn't your decision to make," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the rage and hurt coursing through me. "Dad wanted us to have equal opportunities. You stole from me, Mom. For years, I did what any good mother would do," she countered. "I allocated resources where they were most needed. Your father never understood Megan the way I do. His equal shares approach was simplistic and would have caused more harm than good." When I asked if Megan knew about this arrangement, my mother's momentary hesitation told me everything. "Megan understands family loyalty," she finally said. "Something you clearly need to work on." The implication was clear. My sister had known all along that she was benefiting from my stolen inheritance. This was the third major betrayal, perhaps the most painful of all. My own sister had watched me struggle financially for years while secretly accepting money that rightfully belonged to me. But there was yet another betrayal lurking in the documents. Several of the financial statements and transfer authorizations had been prepared by a name I recognized: Edward Peterson, our family's longtime accountant. The same man who had helped me file my first tax return and had occasionally inquired about my financial situation over the years, always with seeming concern about my money troubles. Mr. Peterson had not only been aware of the fraud but had actively facilitated it, preparing the paperwork necessary for my mother to continue accessing my inheritance long after her legal authority to do so had expired. I was reeling from these discoveries, my entire understanding of my family history collapsing around me. Every memory now required re-examination through this new lens of betrayal. The summer I couldn't afford a car, walking 2 miles to work in all weather, while Megan drove a new Honda my mother had saved for. The nights I'd studied by lamplight because I couldn't afford to run the heat and electricity simultaneously in my cheap apartment, while Megan lived in a doorman building paid for with my money. The countless times my mother had criticized my poor financial planning when I struggled to make ends meet, all while she was actively diverting the funds that could have eased those struggles. I found myself at a crossroads far more significant than the furniture theft that had initiated this journey. I had discovered a conspiracy of theft and deception that had shaped the entire course of my adult life. My career path, my educational choices. Even my personality had been influenced by financial constraints that never should have existed. I called Jessica again, this time with a determination that surprised even me. "This isn't just about furniture anymore," I told her, my voice steady. "I need a lawyer who specializes in estate fraud and financial elder abuse." "Elder abuse?" Jessica questioned. "Your father wasn't elderly when he died. The trust he established for me was still defrauded after his death," I explained. "From what I've read, that can qualify as a form of posthumous financial abuse since it violated his explicit wishes for his estate." Jessica agreed to help me find a specialist, warning me that the path ahead would be difficult. "This will permanently change your family relationships, Allison. Are you prepared for that?" I looked around my half-empty apartment, thinking about the years of unnecessary struggle and the calculated betrayal by those who should have protected me. "The relationships were already broken," I replied. "I just didn't know it until now." That night, I sat at my borrowed table and wrote in my journal, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. I had nearly convinced myself to give up the fight over furniture worth thousands of dollars. How could I possibly walk away from an inheritance worth hundreds of thousands? It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about justice for my father's memory and his wishes for both his daughters. I was no longer on the verge of giving up. I was just getting started. On Jessica's recommendation, I contacted Stephanie Lawrence, an attorney specializing in estate fraud and fiduciary abuse. Unlike the police officer who'd taken my furniture theft report, Stephanie didn't minimize the seriousness of what had happened. She listened intently as I explained the situation, occasionally asking for clarification but never questioning the legitimacy of my concerns. "What your mother has done constitutes several serious offenses," she said after I'd finished. "Conversion of property in the case of the furniture. Breach of fiduciary duty regarding the trust fund. Potentially fraud and identity theft for accessing your financial information. And if Miss Peterson knowingly assisted in these activities as a financial professional, he could be facing both civil liability and professional sanctions." She outlined a multi-pronged approach. First, a civil suit for the return of the furniture, or its monetary equivalent. Second, a more complex case regarding the misappropriated inheritance funds. And third, potential identity theft charges for accessing my bank records. "We'll need to gather significant documentation," Stephanie explained. "Bank statements, investment records, the original trust documents, evidence of withdrawals, and proof of where that money went. It's going to be detailed work, but based on what you've shared, we have a strong case." Over the next several weeks, I became a financial detective in my own life story. I collected bank statements going back years, tracked down old tax returns, and assembled a chronology of financial events that painted a clear picture of systematic theft. One of the most valuable pieces of evidence came from an unexpected source. While searching for documentation, I contacted the bank that had originally held my trust account. A helpful manager there located archived records showing not only the transactions but the authorization forms my mother had used to initiate them. Many of these forms had been submitted after I turned 18, when her power of attorney should have been invalid. "This is exactly what we need," Stephanie said when I presented my findings. "Clear evidence of unauthorized transactions." We also documented the furniture theft meticulously. I provided before and after photos of my apartment, all purchase receipts, credit card statements showing the payments, and even text messages where my mother and sister effectively admitted taking the items without permission. With our evidence assembled, Stephanie drafted a formal civil complaint and prepared to file it with the court. Before doing so, however, she sent a cease and desist letter to my mother, outlining the illegal nature of her actions and demanding the immediate return of my furniture and repayment of the misappropriated trust funds. This gives her one chance to make things right before we escalate to court, Stephanie explained. It's unlikely she'll comply fully, but sometimes a formal legal notice is enough to prompt at least partial cooperation. My mother's response was swift and aggressive. Rather than addressing the substance of our claims, she hired her own attorney who sent a threatening letter suggesting I was mentally unstable and vindictively targeting family members out of jealousy. The letter threatened a countersuit for defamation if I proceeded. More alarmingly, I received reports from family members that my mother was suddenly selling her vacation property in Maine and transferring other assets into new accounts. Stephanie recognized these actions immediately. She's trying to hide assets, she explained. It's a common reaction when someone realizes they might face a significant judgment. We need to request an emergency injunction to prevent further asset transfers. We rushed to file our case and the accompanying injunction request. The judge assigned to the case, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Hamilton, reviewed our evidence and granted a temporary freeze on my mother's major assets pending further hearings. The day after the asset freeze was implemented, my phone exploded with calls and messages from family members. Many were angry, having heard only my mother's version of events, that I was vindictively trying to steal her retirement and leave her destitute over a misunderstanding about some furniture. Others called to express shock at the legal escalation but admitted they didn't know the full story. I directed these more open-minded relatives to Stephanie, who had prepared a factual summary of the case that could be shared. My sister Megan finally called, her voice a mixture of panic and anger. "What the hell are you doing, Allison?" she demanded. "You've frozen Mom's accounts? She can barely pay her bills." Maybe she should have thought about that before stealing over $300,000 from me, I replied evenly. Not to mention my furniture. That's ridiculous. She was just managing money Dad left for both of us. No, Megan. Dad left money specifically for each of us, in equal amounts. I have the documents proving it. Mom took my share and gave it all to you. There was a long silence before Megan spoke again, her voice smaller. I didn't know it was like that. She always said the money came from her savings, or from selling Dad's investments that he left to her. I wasn't sure whether to believe her claimed ignorance. But I pressed on. And the furniture? Did you really think I just spontaneously decided to give you every piece of furniture I owned? Another pause. She said you had agreed to help furnish my new place after the divorce. That you wanted to support me but then changed your mind at the last minute. So she was just following through on your original offer. That never happened, Megan. Not one conversation about giving you my furniture ever took place. Mom stole it, plain and simple. The call ended with Megan in tears, claiming she needed time to process everything. I wasn't convinced her distress was genuine. She had been living with these lies for too long to claim complete innocence. But a small part of me wondered if she too had been manipulated by our mother, albeit in a very different way than I had been. As the legal process advanced, my mother made one final desperate attempt to pressure me into dropping the case. She sent a formal letter through her attorney offering to return the furniture, though many pieces had already been used for months in Megan's apartment, in exchange for me dropping all claims related to the trust fund. This is actually a good sign, Stephanie noted when I showed her the letter. It means they recognize the strength of our case, but it's a lowball offer that addresses only a fraction of what's owed to you. We countered with our own settlement proposal. Return of the furniture in its original condition or its full replacement value, plus repayment of the trust fund with interest, minus legitimate educational expenses that should have been covered by the trust. My mother's attorney rejected our counter offer within hours, and we proceeded to our first court hearing. Judge Hamilton listened carefully to both sides before making her initial assessment. Based on the documentation provided, she stated, looking directly at my mother and her attorney, there appears to be substantial evidence of improper financial management at minimum. I'm particularly troubled by the continued use of power of attorney documentation after Miss Carter reached adulthood, which on its face constitutes an invalid exercise of financial control. She maintained the asset freeze with some modifications to allow for my mother's basic living expenses and set a trial date for 3 months later. As we left the courtroom, I caught my mother's eye. For the first time in my adult life, I saw something I'd never expected: fear. She had always been the authority figure, the one who established the rules and expectations in our family. Now, faced with legal consequences for her actions, she seemed suddenly diminished. I felt no satisfaction in her fear, only sadness that our relationship had deteriorated to this point. That evening, I received an unexpected call from Mr. Peterson, our family accountant. His voice was shaking. "Allison, I want you to know that I never intended. That is, your mother assured me that you had agreed to certain financial arrangements within the family. You helped her steal my inheritance for years," I replied coldly. "You knew she had no legal right to access those funds after I turned 18. It was a complicated situation," he stammered. Family financial matters often involve informal agreements that don't necessarily follow legal structures to the letter. "Save it for the court," I told him before hanging up. His call confirmed what Stephanie had suspected: my mother's deception was beginning to unravel, and those who had enabled her were getting nervous. As the trial date approached, the pressure from family members intensified, but so did my resolve. What had begun with missing furniture had uncovered decades of financial abuse and betrayal. Now that the truth was emerging, there was no going back to the family narrative I'd accepted for so long. Whatever the cost to family relationships, I was determined to see justice done, not just for myself, but for my father, whose final wishes had been so thoroughly violated. 2 weeks before our scheduled court date, I received a call from Uncle Thomas, my father's brother. We had maintained limited contact over the years, mostly holiday cards and occasional family gatherings. After the furniture theft, he had been supportive but somewhat distant, sympathetic to my situation but reluctant to get too involved in what he viewed as an ugly family dispute. "Allison, I've been doing some thinking," he said, his voice uncharacteristically serious, "and some searching too. I need to show you something. Can you come to my house this weekend?" Curious and a bit apprehensive, I agreed. That Saturday, I drove the 2 hours to his home in western Massachusetts. Uncle Thomas led me to his study without much preliminary conversation, unlocked a filing cabinet, and pulled out a worn leather portfolio. "After Robert died, I helped clean out his home office," he explained, referring to my father. "Your mother was overwhelmed at the time, so I packed up his business documents. I returned most of them to her, but these," he hesitated, "these I kept because they concerned me." Inside the portfolio were copies of financial plans and draft wills my father had created in the year before his death. While the final will had established the trusts for Megan and me, these drafts revealed something I hadn't known. My father had been planning to create a much more structured financial arrangement with professional trustees, specifically designed to prevent any one person from controlling the funds. "He was worried about how Diane was handling money," Uncle Thomas said quietly. "They'd had arguments about her spending, especially regarding Megan. He wanted to ensure both of you girls would be treated fairly if anything happened to him." The draft documents included notes from meetings with financial advisors where my father had expressed specific concerns about my mother's tendency to favor Megan financially and his desire to protect Allison's future security. There were even handwritten notes about consulting a divorce attorney. I felt the blood drain from my face. He was planning to divorce Mom? Uncle Thomas nodded grimly. I believe so, though he never said it directly to me. These papers suggest he was at least exploring the option. Your parents' marriage had been troubled for some time before his accident. This revelation cast my family history in an entirely new light. My father had seen the favoritism I'd experienced and had been actively working to protect me from it. His death had not only been a personal tragedy but had derailed his attempts to create financial safeguards for my future. Why didn't you show me these before? I asked, leafing through the documents with trembling hands. Uncle Thomas looked ashamed. I should have. At first, I thought it would only add to your pain after losing him. Then, as years passed, I convinced myself it wasn't my place to interfere. That was wrong of me, Allison. I'm sorry. These documents provided powerful contextual evidence for our case, showing that my father had specific concerns about exactly the type of financial misconduct that subsequently occurred. Stephanie was thrilled when I shared them with her, noting that they established a clear pattern of premeditated behavior rather than isolated poor decisions. But Uncle Thomas wasn't the only unexpected ally to emerge. A few days later, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. It was from Tyler, Megan's ex-husband. We had never been close, and I hadn't spoken to him since their divorce a year earlier. Allison, I heard about what's happening with your mom and Megan, his message began. There's something you should know. When I was moving out of our condo, I overheard Diane and Megan discussing furniture. Your mother specifically said, Allison doesn't need to know until it's already done. Better to ask forgiveness than permission. I thought it was odd at the time, but I had my own problems to deal with. Now I understand what they were planning. He went on to explain that during their marriage, Megan had received numerous large cash gifts from my mother, gifts that coincided with withdrawals from my trust account. Tyler had questioned the source of this money, especially given my mother's modest income as a boutique manager, but had been told it came from family investments. I always wondered why your mother seemed to have endless funds for Megan but claimed she couldn't help you during tough times, he wrote. It never added up. Tyler agreed to provide a sworn statement about what he had witnessed, adding another piece to the mounting evidence against my mother and sister. Armed with these new revelations, Stephanie suggested we expand our investigation to trace exactly how my father's insurance money had been used after his death. What we found was disturbing, a pattern of systematic financial support for Megan that went far beyond normal parental assistance. My mother had used the life insurance proceeds, money intended to support the entire family, to fund a lifestyle for Megan that included international vacations, a luxury car, cosmetic procedures, and even a failed business venture. Meanwhile, I had been told repeatedly that money was tight and that I needed to be financially independent. As we pieced together this financial history, I received yet another unexpected call, this one from my grandmother, my father's mother, who was now in her 80s and living in a retirement community in Florida. Allison, dear, I've been hearing about this trouble with your mother, she said, her voice frail but clear. There's something I need to tell you before it's too late. Something your father told me before he died. During what turned out to be their final visit together, my father had confided in his mother that he was deeply concerned about my mother's behavior and financial decisions. He had discovered she was diverting family funds to support Megan's extravagant requests while dismissing my more modest needs. He told me, Mom, if anything ever happens to me, watch out for Allison. Diane will make sure Megan is taken care of, but Allison might be left to fend for herself. My grandmother's voice broke as she shared this decades-old conversation. I should have done more after he died, but your mother kept me at a distance. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. The final piece of the puzzle came from Gerald Morrison, my father's longtime friend and business associate. Gerald reached out after hearing about the legal proceedings from mutual acquaintances. I never wanted to speak ill of Diane, he told me over coffee at a quiet cafe. But what she's done to you isn't right, and Robert would be devastated. Gerald revealed that in the months before his death, my father had confided that he suspected my mother was already misusing family funds. He had found evidence that she had opened credit cards in his name and was making large purchases for Megan while telling him the expenses were for household necessities. He was putting financial safeguards in place, planning to confront her once everything was secured, Gerald explained. The accident happened before he could complete those arrangements. With each new revelation, the picture became clearer. What I had experienced wasn't simply favoritism or poor financial management. It was a calculated, long-term strategy by my mother to divert resources from me to my sister. A strategy that had begun even before my father's death and had accelerated dramatically once he was no longer alive to prevent it. At Stephanie's suggestion, I began working with a therapist who specialized in family trauma. Dr. Winters helped me understand the psychological dynamics that had shaped our family. Based on what you've described, your mother displays many classic traits of narcissistic personality disorder, she explained. The excessive favoritism toward one child, called the golden child, and the devaluation of another, the scapegoat, is a common pattern in families with a narcissistic parent. This insight helped me understand why my mother had been so resistant to acknowledging any wrongdoing. In her distorted worldview, she was justified in taking what was mine because she didn't truly see me as entitled to equal treatment or resources. My achievements were threatening rather than a source of pride. My independence was an affront rather than a strength. As our court date approached, I felt both stronger and more wounded than ever. The support from unexpected allies had bolstered my resolve, but each new discovery also reopened the pain of betrayal. The furniture theft that had initiated this journey now seemed almost trivial compared to the decades of calculated deception I had uncovered. Yet in an odd way, I was grateful for that initial theft. Had my mother been more patient or subtle in her actions, I might never have discovered the full truth about my family. Sometimes, I reflected, it takes a blatant injustice to reveal the quieter ones that have been happening all along. The week before our scheduled court date, Stephanie received a call from my mother's attorney requesting a settlement conference. After months of aggressive opposition, it seemed my mother was finally open to negotiation. Stephanie suspected the change in strategy was due to our mounting evidence and the temporary asset freeze that had restricted my mother's financial activities. They're feeling the pressure, Stephanie explained. The discovery process has exposed financial improprieties they can't easily explain away in court. A settlement lets them avoid public testimony and potentially harsher penalties from the judge. We agreed to the conference, which was set for the following day at Stephanie's office. I was nervous but prepared, having spent hours reviewing our evidence and discussing potential settlement terms. Stephanie had advised me to remain calm regardless of what was said, letting her handle the legal aspects while I focused on the outcomes I wanted to achieve. When my mother arrived with her attorney, I was struck by how much older she looked than when I'd last seen her months earlier. The stress of the legal proceedings had taken a visible toll. Megan accompanied them, looking equally strained, her usual confident demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. After initial formalities, my mother's attorney presented their offer. They would return the furniture that remained in Megan's possession. Some pieces had already been sold or damaged. Pay $50,000 toward the trust fund discrepancy, and agree to a non-disclosure agreement preventing any party from discussing the dispute publicly. Stephanie calmly explained why the offer was inadequate. Our forensic accounting shows misappropriation of approximately $320,000 from Miss Carter's trust, plus roughly $85,000 in interest that would have accrued. The furniture, at replacement value, adds another $13,000, $800. Your offer addresses less than 15% of the total damages. My mother's attorney began citing various legal theories about why the trust fund issue was more ambiguous than we claimed, but I could see from his expression that these were desperate arguments. The documentation Uncle Thomas had provided, combined with the bank records showing unauthorized withdrawals after my 18th birthday, created an overwhelmingly clear case of fiduciary breach. After several hours of back-and-forth negotiations, with both sides occasionally retreating to separate rooms for private discussions, we reached an impasse. My mother was willing to increase her financial offer to $100,000 but insisted this was her absolute maximum. Stephanie and I both knew this was still grossly inadequate given the documented losses. I think we've taken this settlement approach as far as it can go, Stephanie finally said. We'll see you in court next week unless your clients reconsider their position. As we prepared to end the meeting, Megan suddenly spoke up. Wait. Can I talk to Allison alone, please? The attorneys exchanged glances, then agreed to a 15-minute private conversation between my sister and me. They left us in the conference room, the door closing behind them with a soft click. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Megan looked at her hands, then finally raised her eyes to meet mine. I didn't know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, about the trust fund. I mean, not the full story. Mom always told me the money was from her savings, or from Dad's life insurance, that was meant for both of us. I studied her face, searching for signs of deception. You never questioned where all that money was coming from? Mom was a boutique manager. Megan, how could she possibly afford to buy you a condo, pay for your semester abroad, fund your wedding? I guess I didn't want to question it, she admitted, a flush creeping up her neck. It was easier to believe what she told me, that she was just being generous, that you were doing fine on your own because you were so independent and successful. She paused, wiping away a tear. When I saw all the financial records during discovery, God, Allison, seeing it all laid out like that. Year after year of her taking your money while you were working those awful jobs, struggling with student loans. I feel sick about it. And the furniture? I pressed, still not fully trusting her apparent remorse. That was wrong. Completely wrong. She shook her head. Mom convinced me you had initially offered to help furnish my place after the divorce but then changed your mind. She said taking the furniture while you were at work was just following through on your original intention. That never happened, Megan. I never offered my furniture to anyone. I know that now, she said quietly. I should have questioned it at the time. It didn't make sense, but I was so desperate after leaving Tyler, and Mom was so insistent that you owed me this help. We talked for the remainder of our allotted time, Megan gradually revealing how our mother had manipulated her throughout her life as well, in very different ways than she had manipulated me. While I had been cast as the independent one who needed to make my own way, Megan had been made dependent, constantly told she couldn't survive without help, that she wasn't capable of standing on her own. She needed you to struggle and me to be dependent, Megan concluded. It gave her control over both of us. When our attorneys returned, Megan made a surprising announcement. I want to return all the furniture immediately, she said firmly. And I'll testify about everything I know regarding the financial situation if the case goes to court. My mother's face contorted with rage. You ungrateful little, she began, before her attorney quickly silenced her with a warning hand on her arm. The settlement conference ended without resolution, but Megan's change of position dramatically altered the dynamics of the case. True to her word, she arranged for all the remaining furniture to be returned to my apartment the next day, though several pieces had been damaged beyond repair. More significantly, she provided a detailed written statement corroborating many aspects of our case against my mother, including conversations she had witnessed about accessing my trust fund and plans to take my furniture. While she maintained she hadn't fully understood the legal implications of these actions at the time, her testimony was devastating to my mother's defense. 3 days before our scheduled court date, my mother's attorney contacted Stephanie with a new settlement offer. My mother would acknowledge the misappropriation of trust funds and agree to repay $275,000, not the full amount we had calculated but substantially closer to it. She would also replace any damaged furniture at full retail value and cover my legal fees. After careful consideration and discussion with Stephanie, I accepted the offer. While it wasn't complete justice, it represented significant accountability, and avoiding a prolonged court battle would allow me to begin moving forward with my life. The settlement agreement was formally signed the day before our scheduled court appearance. As part of the terms, my mother was required to provide a written acknowledgement of her actions, not a public confession, but at least a private admission of wrongdoing that I could share with family members who had been misled about the situation. When the final meeting concluded, my mother approached me in the hallway outside the conference room. I braced myself for another attack or justification, but instead, she simply said, "You're exactly like your father, stubborn, uncompromising." She didn't say it as a compliment, but I took it as one anyway. "You can't take what you never truly gave, Mom," I replied quietly. "Not my furniture, not my inheritance, and certainly not your unconditional love." She flinched as if I'd slapped her, then turned and walked away without another word. It was the last time we spoke directly. Through her attorney, she later communicated that she would be selling her house and moving to Arizona, effectively removing herself from the family circle she could no longer control. The judge who had overseen our case seemed genuinely shocked by the evidence we had presented, even in summary form during the settlement approval hearing. "In my 20 years on the bench," she remarked, "I've seldom seen such a clear pattern of financial exploitation within a family. Miss Carter," she addressed me directly, "the court commends your courage in bringing these matters to light. Family financial abuse often goes unreported and unaddressed due to shame or fear of damaging relationships. You have shown remarkable resilience." As news of the settlement spread through our extended family, the reactions were mixed. Some relatives, particularly those closer to my mother, maintained that I had overreacted to a simple misunderstanding about the furniture, refusing to acknowledge the larger pattern of financial abuse. Others, armed with the documentation I was now free to share, expressed shock and support. My mother's sister, Aunt Patricia, called me in tears after reading the evidence summary I had sent her. "I had no idea it was this bad," she said. "All these years, I believed Diane when she said she was just helping both her girls in different ways. I'm so sorry I didn't see what was happening to you." The family friend who had witnessed my mother's early plans, Gerald Morrison, helped me establish connections with my father's other friends and colleagues. Relationships that had been systematically discouraged by my mother after his death. Through these connections, I gained a fuller picture of who my father had been and the future he had envisioned for me. As for Megan, our relationship entered a complex new phase. Her break from our mother's influence seemed genuine, and she made consistent efforts to make amends, including returning personal items of our father's that my mother had given to her over the years while telling me they had been lost or sold. We began meeting occasionally for coffee, carefully rebuilding a relationship that had never been allowed to develop naturally due to our mother's manipulations. Trust came slowly, and I maintained firm boundaries, but there was a cautious optimism that we might eventually establish a healthier sibling bond. The settlement funds allowed me to replace the damaged furniture, pay off the remainder of my student loans, and establish the emergency fund I had been working toward when the original theft occurred. More importantly, they represented a long overdue acknowledgement of the injustice I had experienced. My mother, true to her nature, refused to accept responsibility even after signing the settlement agreement. Through various family channels, she continued to portray herself as the victim of an ungrateful daughter's vindictiveness. Though these narratives found increasingly less receptive audiences as the truth became known. The legal victory, while significant, was only the beginning of a longer healing process. The psychological wounds of lifelong favoritism and betrayal wouldn't be erased by financial compensation alone. But for the first time in my adult life, I felt a sense of validation and justice that allowed me to begin moving forward without the weight of unacknowledged family trauma holding me back. 1 year after the settlement, I stood in the living room of my new home, watching as movers carefully positioned my restored sectional sofa against the wall. After months of repairs and replacements, I finally had all my furniture back, some pieces good as new, others replaced entirely due to damage sustained during their time in Megan's apartment. The navy velvet sectional, which had been the first piece taken and the symbolic heart of the theft, had required extensive restoration but now looked almost exactly as it had before. My new home was a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing extravagant, but entirely mine in a way my previous apartment had never quite felt. The settlement funds had provided the down payment, while my continued success at work covered the mortgage. More importantly, I had installed a comprehensive security system and changed all the locks myself. No one, not even Megan during our tentative reconciliation attempts, had been given a spare key. The past year had been a journey of healing that proved in many ways more challenging than the legal battle itself. With the external conflict resolved, I had to face the internal wounds created by decades of family dysfunction. Dr. Winters, my therapist, had been instrumental in this process, helping me understand that my worth was not determined by my mother's inability to love me properly or my sister's complicity in family patterns. Family trauma doesn't just disappear when justice is served, she had explained during one particularly difficult session. The court validated the financial harm you experienced, but only you can validate and process the emotional harm. Through therapy, I had begun to recognize and dismantle the unhealthy coping mechanisms I developed over the years. The excessive self-reliance that prevented me from asking for help when needed, the hypervigilance about finances that sometimes tipped into anxiety, the reflexive distrust of people who showed genuine care or generosity. I had also established clear boundaries with remaining family members. Uncle Thomas and I had developed a closer relationship, with regular calls and visits, that helped fill some of the paternal void in my life. He shared stories about my father that my mother had never told, helping me build a more complete picture of the man who had tried to protect me even after his death. My relationship with my grandmother, my father's mother, had also deepened. Though her advanced age and distance made in-person visits difficult, our weekly phone calls became a source of comfort for both of us. "You remind me so much of Robert," she often said. "Not just in looks, but in spirit. That same quiet determination, that kindness that never hardens into bitterness despite hardship." With Megan, the path forward had been more complicated. After her crucial testimony and the return of my furniture, she had seemed genuinely committed to rebuilding our relationship on healthier terms. She had entered therapy herself, beginning the difficult work of examining her role in the family dynamic and the harm she had benefited from. Our initial coffee meetings had been awkward and tense, with conversation limited to safe topics like movies and current events. Gradually, however, we had begun addressing the painful realities of our shared past. Megan had apologized, not just for the furniture theft but for years of accepting preferential treatment, while watching me struggle. "I told myself you were fine with it," she had admitted during one particularly honest conversation. "That you were the strong one who didn't need help." It was easier than acknowledging what was really happening. I had set strict conditions for our continued relationship. Complete honesty about the past, respect for my boundaries in the present, and no financial entanglements of any kind. Megan had accepted these terms, and while our relationship would never be the uncomplicated sisterhood depicted in heartwarming movies, we had established a cautious connection based on mutual respect rather than maternal manipulation. My mother, meanwhile, had maintained her stance of wounded innocence even after the settlement. She had indeed sold her house and moved to Arizona, where she apparently told new acquaintances that she had relocated to escape an ungrateful daughter who had sued her over a misunderstanding about furniture. She had made no attempts to contact me directly, though occasional messages came through other family members, always containing subtle digs or attempts to provoke guilt rather than genuine attempts at reconciliation. Dr. Winters had helped me understand that my mother's inability to acknowledge her wrongdoing was part of her narcissistic personality structure. For her to admit what she did, she explained, would collapse her entire self-image. She's constructed an identity as the perfect, sacrificing mother. Acknowledging her exploitation of you would require a complete reconstruction of who she believes herself to be. This insight didn't excuse my mother's actions, but it helped me stop expecting an apology or recognition that would never come. I had learned to find validation in the truth I knew and the support of those who acknowledged it, rather than continuing to seek it from someone constitutionally incapable of providing it. My professional life had flourished despite, or perhaps partly because of the personal challenges I'd faced. The hospital where I worked as an administrator had promoted me to Director of Patient Services, a position that allowed me to implement improvements in care delivery while maintaining work-life balance. The leadership skills I'd developed during the legal battle, remaining calm under pressure, advocating effectively for myself, assembling and presenting complex information had translated surprisingly well to my professional advancement. Perhaps the most unexpected development in my healing journey had been the relationships I'd formed with others who had experienced similar family financial abuse. Through a support group Dr. Winters had recommended, I had met people whose stories echoed aspects of my own: adult children whose inheritances had been misappropriated, siblings who had been systematically favored or scapegoated, individuals struggling to establish financial independence after years of family manipulation. I had initially attended these meetings seeking support for myself, but gradually found myself in a position to offer guidance to others just beginning their journey toward recognition and resolution. The legal knowledge I had gained through my own case, combined with my personal experience of the emotional aspects of family financial betrayal, made me a valuable resource for those facing similar situations. This role as a mentor and advocate had given new meaning to my experience, transforming what could have been merely a personal tragedy into an opportunity to help others. I had even been invited to speak at a conference on financial elder abuse, sharing insights on how the same legal frameworks could sometimes be applied to posthumous financial exploitation of estates. As I settled into my new home, surrounded by furniture that now symbolized not just material possessions but a reclamation of my autonomy and worth, I reflected on the lessons of the past 18 months. The betrayal had been devastating, but it had also forced me to confront and heal family wounds that might otherwise have festered unaddressed for a lifetime. I had learned that true family is defined by love and respect, not obligation or biology. The people who had stood by me during the legal battle, Jessica, Uncle Thomas, even my ex-brother-in-law Tyler, had demonstrated more genuine family loyalty than my mother ever had. I had discovered my own capacity for resilience, for standing firm in the truth even when pressured to accept convenient lies. This strength had always been within me, but the crucible of confrontation had refined and revealed it fully. Most importantly, I had learned that breaking cycles of dysfunction requires courage and clarity. By refusing to accept the narrative my mother had constructed, by that taking what was mine was somehow justified by my sister's greater need, I had not only reclaimed my material inheritance but had begun to reshape emotional and psychological legacy I would carry forward. The furniture around me was beautiful, functional, and rightfully mine. But the true value of what I had fought for went far beyond sectional sofas and dining tables. I had fought for recognition, for justice, for the right to be treated with basic fairness and respect. In winning that fight, I had gained something no one could ever take from me again: the unshakable knowledge of my own worth and the determination to protect it. My mother took my furniture, and in doing so, inadvertently gave me the push I needed to reclaim everything else she had taken over the years: my financial security, my family relationships, and most importantly, my sense of self. It was a gift she never intended to give, but one for which, in my most honest moments, I could almost feel grateful. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who crossed boundaries or took advantage of you? How did you handle it? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Also, if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for more stories about family dynamics, personal growth, and standing up for yourself. Thank you so much for listening to my journey, and remember, sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones we need protection from. Recognizing that truth is the first step toward healing. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.